Well, this morning we are going to continue with our study in the book of Esther, and we've reached chapter 9 of Esther. And this morning we're going to be looking at the first part of chapter 9, and then Derek, next week, will do the second part of chapter 9. So our reading this morning is Esther chapter 9, verses 1 to 19. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. But now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities and all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them, because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And the nobles of all the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed Parashandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poraratha, Adelia, Arilitha, Parmashata, Arisai, Ardai, and Zaphatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. The number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and 10 of the sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will also be granted." "If it pleases the king," Esther answered, "give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's sons be impaled on poles." So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they impaled the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay hands on their plunder. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made it a day of fasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and the 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of fasting and joy. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day of joy and fasting, a day for giving presents to each other. Amen, and may God bless the reading of his holy word. This morning, we move into the final stage of the book of Esther, and near our story's conclusion. Last week, we read about how Mordecai's counter-decree, which matched the terms of Haman's evil plan, and allowed the Jewish people to defend themselves. This morning, we turn our attention to that fateful day on the calendar, when the Jewish people are allowed to protect themselves against those who want to harm them. This morning's story is a conclusion of a story that started several years before, and it comes to a close in chapter 9 of Esther. Throughout this time, we have been aware of how God has been working away in the background, using flawed and, let's face it, sometimes quite nasty people to protect his people and for his plans to come to fruition. While reading about this chapter in preparation for this morning, all the kind of commentators and theologians that I was reading continually talked about the providence of God and how this can be seen in chapter 9 of Esther. So this morning, we are going to think in greater detail about the providence of God. We will begin this morning by kind of having an overview of the chapter. Then we're going to look at what does the word providence mean before applying it to the book of Esther, and then thinking about the providence of God in our own lives before drawing to a conclusion. Our chapter this morning starts with the author telling us that the day of the edict had arrived. However, the position of the Jews had changed dramatically from when the edict was written. When Haman issued the decree, the Jews were kind of a small group of insignificant refugees with no position of power or authority. However, this is no longer the case. The author tells us that there has been a complete and utter flipping of the tables. In the original Hebrew, the word used by the author gives more detail than we have in English, and basically the term used tells us that those who were at the bottom are now at the top, and those who are at the top are now at the bottom. The whole picture had flipped 180 degrees. Not only were the Jewish people in positions of power and well prepared for the assault of their enemies against them, they also had the help by the Persians in the positions of power. They were probably so afraid because of this amazing turnaround and because of Mordecai and how powerful he was becoming, that they helped the Jewish people, maybe fearful of what would happen if they didn't help them. What would that mean for them? While defending themselves, the author makes special mention that the sons of Haman were also killed. And again, the Hebrew text is slightly different from our translation in English. And you can see here that these bold writing, that is the 10 names of the sons of Haman. They're set apart from the body of the text, maybe highlighting how particularly evil, almost in a different league from the other people that were attacking the Jews. The next part of the text is probably the most troubling for modern day readers like ourselves, as Esther asks Xerxes if the killing in Susa could continue the next day. And when I was reading for this, there was a huge variety of different opinions as to the reasons behind this. There were some who believed that basically it was pure overkill. The power had gone to her head and she was just kind of almost vengeful. But there was others who were saying, well, no. The reason that she did this was because she realized that there was still a continued threat to the Jews in Susa. So she had to continue the killing for the next day to protect her people. Ultimately, the author doesn't really give us any indication as to the reasons behind the continued killing. From the end of chapter 9, it's clear that the Jewish people's enemies were well and truly defeated. The Jewish people were on the up within the Persian Empire. From being a band of refugees whose very existence was in question, they'd not only successfully defeated the plan of Haman, but they'd had him killed and replaced him with Mordecai. You may remember from the previous weeks that I've said that one of the important themes within the book of Esther is whether God still keeps his covenant with his people, even though they were in foreign lands. Chapter 9 is a resounding yes. He keeps his covenant with his people and still cares for them, even though they're hundreds of miles from the promised land. But what has changed from the other Old Testament books is how God acts and guides his people. At earlier times, when God led his people, it was through direct divine intervention. Think of when Moses or Joshua were leading the people. God would make his intentions very clear. He would be a pillar of fire in the evening and a pillar of smoke in the morning. And that's how he directed his people. However, in the book of Esther, God is working in the background. He is using his providence rather than direct divine intervention to fulfill his plans. And for us, that should give us hope, because 99% of the time, God doesn't use direct divine intervention in our lives to fulfill his plans, but is using his providence to care for us. And it's now to providence that we now turn. If you can change the slides. Thank you. To start with, I think it's important that we define what do we mean by providence. It's a word I'm sure we've heard of. It's one of those words that you probably in your head know what you mean or what it means, but if someone asked you, it'd be quite hard to define what it is. And I think the meaning of the word in relation to God is best summed up in the Heidelberg Catechism. And I'm not sure if it's not the best, but hopefully you're able to read that there. But basically it states, what do you understand by the providence of God? God's providence is his almighty and ever-present power, whereby, as with his hand, he still upholds heaven and earth and all creatures, and so governs them that the leaf and blade, rain and drought, fruitful and barren years, food and drink, health and sickness, riches and poverty, indeed all things, come to us not by chance, but by his fatherly hand. The Heidelberg Catechism was written in Germany in 1563 by a team of theologians, but it confirms the basic definition of the understanding of the word providence. It means that God controls everything, from the smallest detail to the most significant detail. And it stands in direct opposition to the belief that the universe is governed by chance or fate. Thank you, Craig. If we take that definition into the book of Esther, we can see that God's providence is acting to protect and secure the safety of his people several times throughout the book of Esther. Right from the start, we can see that in the fact that Vashti defies her husband and is removed and is replaced by Esther, a Jew. After that, Mordecai hears a plot to assassinate Xerxes, but he's not rewarded for his help. Then Haman comes to power and makes an evil plan to kill all the Jews because he hates them, and particularly Mordecai. Mordecai repulses Haman so much that he makes his own gallows for him, hoping that the king will agree to allow him to impale him on them. Then that one sleepless night in Susa, Xerxes discovers that Mordecai has not been honoured the way he should. And he gets Haman to parade him round the streets. And just as he'd finished that, Haman is whisked off to a private dinner with the king and queen, unbeknown to him that it was actually his last supper. In all of these situations, each character wants different things and has other motivations. When Xerxes is acting, all he wants is a quiet kingdom, a quiet empire. When Haman is acting, all he wants is more praise and honour from people. And Esther, when she is acting in the story, all she wants initially is a quiet life. But then she develops a concern for her people. The whole story is littered with people with different motivations. And they are actively pursuing those ambitions. But still, behind this, God is working those decisions that they have for his own plan. Even though the people's motivations goes from good motivations to downright evil in the plan of Haman. Each of the characters in the story of Esther has their own free will and acts to get what they want. But God is still there and using their decisions for his own plan, even if it comes from a wrong motivation. The story reaches its high point in our reading today in Esther Chapter 9, where we read that God's plan eventually leads the Jewish people to be able to defend and to defeat their enemies. The story of Esther highlights how God's providence helps protect his people from harm, and how he uses each human character's own ambition to carry out his own will. We're now going to turn our attention to our own lives and help think about God's providence acting in our own lives. I'm sure we have maybe heard stories about God acting in people's life. Maybe they're going through a particularly rough patch and they come through it and they know that this rough patch has been from God, and it basically is an opportunity for them to deeper understand God. There might have been people that have been going down a bad path, and then God has put someone in their way, and that has allowed them to change their life around. Ultimately, I can only speak about my own experience, but I found that I'm most aware of God's providence, most particularly during difficult periods of my life. And usually what happens is, at the time, I'm not aware of it. But weeks, months, even years maybe down the line, when I've gained a bit of time, a bit of perspective, I'm like, yeah, that's God acting in my life. And one of those particularly difficult periods is when I was rejected as a candidate for ministry in my first time of going through the process. I got accepted my second time, but my first time, I got all the way to essentially the finish line and then was rejected at that point. Up until that point, the application process had been plain sailing. I started the process with what's called a period of discernment, and I had that at Christon with Mark Malcolm. And I sailed through the local review, which is kind of the first wee hurdle that you give you, where you're asked questions and kind of a wee interview. I got through that fine. Then came the National Assessment Conference in the Conforti Institute in Coatbridge. And I thought actually it went okay. If you asked me the day after, I was like, it was all right. It was fine. But eventually, I got my rejection letter through. And it says if I want to reapply, I would have to wait 12 months. And when I got that letter, I was so annoyed. I was so annoyed at the church. I'm like, why are you rejecting me? I'll be a good minister. But after speaking it through with my parents, with Mark, with other close friends, I realised that actually they probably made the correct decision at that time. And over the next few months, I had it was a period of limbo where I didn't know if I would reapply. Did God want me to reapply? Did God want me to work in insurance, is where I worked at that time? It was all over the place. However, over the next 12 months, as I waited to reapply again, I met Lorna. We got engaged. And looking back at that, the disappointment of not getting into ministry, I do believe that God was lining up the correct person for me to later marry, but also maybe change a bit of arrogance which I went into the process the last time. But I only realised that over time. If I'd got into ministry the first time, I don't know if I'd have met Lorna, because with university and placements, it's quite a busy time. And as I said, I had a bit of an arrogance about me, which wouldn't have stood me in the goods for being a minister. Now, please don't take this the wrong way, that what I'm trying to apply is that, all the bad stuff, all the difficult situations that people go through, we just need to look at the silver linings or the good stuff. Or trying to trivialize the pain and suffering people are gone or are going through. There's so much difficult and awful situations which people have to endure. And I'm sure we'd all love to know what God is doing in a particular situation. But ultimately, this side of heaven, we might not fully understand what God has in store for us. I want to end this sermon, don't want to end on a negative note, but I want to end with hope. And there is hope in difficult situations for those who believe in Jesus. That he took our sin on the cross and he rose 3 days later. The providence of God throws up so many questions, because if God is in control of everything, why does bad stuff happen in our world? And this is just a wee foretaste of maybe what we'll talk about in a few weeks' time, if anyone wants to sign up to looking at those questions with me. And the simplest answer is it because of sin. We live in an imperfect world where bad stuff does happen. But the amazing thing is that God, through his Son, broke into our sinful world. Through his death and resurrection, he has conquered death. And for all of us who believe in him, our present suffering is nothing compared to the glory to come. I want to close this morning by watching a brief video which tells us about the hope that we have. And Glenn says it in a better way than I probably ever could. Now, in the video, Glenn is primarily talking about cancer, which is obviously a horrible disease, but the fundamental principles that he's talking about can also relate to other hardship that people go through.
Well, cancer is horrific, it's tragic, it's an enemy. Cancer is where something originally life-giving, cell division, goes wrong and gets twisted into something deadly. So actually, cancer reflects the Bible story where an originally good world falls into death, disease, and decay. And when things like cancer hit, we all ask why. We need to ask why. But without the God of the Bible, we can't actually ask why. Think about the alternatives to Christianity. You've got karma and you've got chaos. Karma says the universe dishes out perfect justice. Therefore, there is no such thing as unjust suffering. You cannot ask why. But if you come across to the chaos point of view, that's atheism, there's no rhyme nor reason to anything. It's all random. But if everything is random, nothing is wrong. Not really. So with karma and with chaos, you cannot even ask the why question. But we're always asking why. Just read in the Bible, Job or the Psalms, and then when the Son of God comes in the flesh, he stood at gravesides crying, getting angry at death. And on the cross, he suffered supremely, taking up our why question before God, praying, my God, why? God does not run from the why question. He embraces it, speaks it, and takes it through the valley of the shadow of death and out into resurrection joy. Jesus doesn't so much answer our specific why questions, but uniquely he allows you to ask them, uniquely he joins you in the suffering, and uniquely he gives you a future beyond karma, beyond chaos, and beyond cancer.
That was a short clip where Glenn is speaking about, I think the question was, why does God allow cancer? And this is part of a series. It's Premier Christianity, and it's essentially a forum where atheists and people like Glenn and other apologists debate serious questions about life and questions that people might have. Now, as I said, Glenn is primarily talking about cancer, but the fundamental principles of what he said could be related to every kind of horrible and terrible situation that we might face in life. We have a God that has promised to come alongside us in our suffering and has given us hope to look forward to in spending eternity with him. Esther Chapter 9 is almost the crowning glory of the Esther story. The Jewish people have done the unimaginable in being able to defeat their enemy. And this morning we've looked at how God's providence in each stage or each chapter, we see God working out his plan, using the characters and their own ambitions for his own plan to save his people. In our own lives, I'm sure there might be stories we're able to share where we believe that God has used his providence in our lives. But as Glenn says, we have hope. We have a hope that God will journey with us no matter what we face in life. This morning and this week, I want us maybe to think about the providence of God. It might be a nice, helpful exercise to kind of think back in your life and think of situations where God might have acted by maybe putting someone in place that's kind of veered your life in a certain direction or certain things happening to you. Amen.